Welcome to Season 2 of Nuances Beyond First Impressions with the Asian Diaspora. Together, we wanted to create a safe space where everyone can learn more about our diverse communities, the complicated relationships we have with our culture, and how they intersect with feminism, queerness, disability, anti-racism, career choices, politics, and more.
I'm Ariadne Mila, a Filipino-American from a small town on the southern border of Texas.
And I'm Sherilyn Lee, aka Lazu, a new American originally from the only place a dodo bird ever lived, Mauritius. Before we get into our interview with Qasim, I just want to let you know, trigger warning, we will be discussing domestic violence in this episode. If that's an issue for you, feel free to skip this one. As for definitions, the Jim Crow era was when state and local governments enforced racial segregation in the U.S. from the late 1800s until 1965. And without further ado, let's talk to Qasim. This is going to be a great one, so strap in.
Today we are here with Qasim Rashid. Qasim is a Pakistani-born human rights lawyer, author, and executive director of Common Purpose, an organization dedicated to electing more women and underrepresented Americans to public office. Through his work, he supports survivors of domestic and sexual violence, represents asylum seekers, uplifts the incarcerated through prison chaplaincy, and advocates for universal religious freedom. His advocacy brings nuance, kindness, and mutual respect to some of the most polarizing discussions today. His writing has been published in Salon, New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and many more. He is the author of 4 books, including the critically acclaimed The Wrong Kind of Muslim and children's book Hannah and the Ramadan Gift. When he is not working, this proud immigrant is making dad jokes for his wife Aisha and their 3 children in Naperville, Illinois. Qasim, thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to have you.
It's my privilege to be here with both of you. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, we'd like to start with a little bit about your background.
I was an immigrant to this country, and I say I'm a fortunate immigrant to this country in that we came here in the 1980s. And if you've had a chance to study immigration history in the United States, prior to 1965, Asians weren't allowed to immigrate here. And the 1965 Immigration Rights Act was part of the negotiation of the Civil Rights Act. And so one thing I remind my fellow Asian Americans is express gratitude to the Black civil rights leaders who made our immigration here possible. Growing up, I was fortunate to have amazing teachers. My parents are teachers. And when I talk about teachers, I don't just mean in the classroom. Certainly had great teachers in the classroom, but outside of that, this is 1980s, 1990s, and the generation that were young men and women during the civil rights era were now the older generation. So being able to learn from them directly was something that I cherished. And at the time, I didn't quite appreciate because I didn't have context. And now as I'm older and in my 40s myself, understanding just who I was spending time with, jazz musicians, people who were marching on Washington, people who were leading the charge. It was really one of the most fortunate things I've ever had happen in my life. Completed my undergrad in Chicago, University of Illinois, Chicago. Went to law school on the guidance, and guidance is probably too generous a word, probably order of my wife to go to law school. And it was a good instruction, and I'm glad I followed through. In law school is where I really got more heavily involved. It was about taking the work from a humanitarian standpoint and then becoming a better advocate with the power of the law, understanding how law can be used to manipulate people's lives and figuring out how do we help people's lives. And so that's where working with the Virginia Poverty Law Center, the Office of Domestic and Sexual Violence, working in prison chaplaincy, starting my own nonprofit, really emboldened in my mind what needs to happen long term. And that's the work I've been fortunate to do for the last nearly 15 years. Extremely grateful for that. And hopefully we can continue to push forward and transform that advocacy into better policy.
Awesome. So you broached the subject a little bit, but what was your experience like growing up a Muslim in the U.S. in the 80s and 90s? And how has that changed since 9/11?
I think sometimes people have rose-colored glasses about life for American Muslims before 9/11. And while it certainly got worse in some respects, I don't want to make it seem like it was all hunky-dory beforehand. There's a deep connection between race and religion, especially when you look at America emerging out of a Jim Crow era in the 1960s. That's yesterday's newspaper, right? And as I think back to it, that's just 20 years before my family and I arrived. In fact, just a decade before my father first arrived on these shores. The American Muslim community is the most racially and ethnically diverse community in the country. And the largest demographic of American Muslims are Black Muslims. And there's been a modern resurgence of Islam among Black Americans in the 1920s. I call that a resurgence because the core of American Islam were the enslaved Africans who were enslaved, trafficked, and forcibly brought here, and many forced to leave their faith as well. Scholars estimate that up to a third of the Africans enslaved and trafficked here were Muslim. And there's no way a third of African Americans today are Muslim, right? So there was a lot of physical persecution and religious persecution to torture that religion out of them. Some of the most prominent slave revolts were of Muslims who were scholars, who were academics. Scholars write about this. Professor Hall from the University of Chicago writes about how the Africans who were enslaved, who were Muslim, they were problematic because they were learned men and women. They could read and write, and they were scholars. And so they were able to communicate and effectively organize against these enslavers. That was the history I was taught as a young person growing up. And so for me, I had a sense of pride in knowing that maybe not from a racially ancestral standpoint, but from a religiously ancestral standpoint in America, American Muslims built this country, right, from the ground up. They helped build the White House. They helped build the roads, the infrastructure, and built the economic base. So that lack of education in the school system was frustrating for me growing up, right? In the public school system, that just isn't taught. You certainly had examples of Islamophobic rhetoric, especially post the World Trade Center bombings in 1993. People think about obviously 9/11, but in 93 it was bombed as well. And there was absolutely no shortage of Islamophobic rhetoric at that time too. Let's not forget the Iraq War in 2003 was the second Iraq War. There's a really well-written piece called Unworthy Victims that talks about how Western bombings have killed 4 million Muslim civilians since 1980. 4 million civilians. We're not even talking about militant groups or however you want to define that, or soldiers. We're talking civilians, 4 million. It's a horrifying statistic. And I think 9/11 obviously made things a lot worse. It was an attack on my faith. It was an attack on my country. My brother was an active duty U.S. Marine at the time. And you wonder, is he going to be sent off to war? These questions come through your mind when in 2001, I was 19? And I think it's one of those things where you recognize that whether you like it or not, you're suddenly a spokesperson for 1.6 billion people. And if you don't actively tell your own story and tell your own narrative, it's going to be told for you and not necessarily in a way that you like. And so that for me was more of a wake-up call. Not only do we need to play a more active role in countering the misinformation by extremists who claim they're Muslim, but we also need to be more active in countering the misinformation by extremists who are anti-Muslim as well. And the only thing that they have in common is that they're horribly ignorant about Islam and they use unsavory, sometimes violent means to promote that. And so a lot of the work and advocacy I believe in is how do we bring people together on these common causes of justice to overcome the misinformation violence that Muslim extremists and anti-Muslim extremists both try to espouse.
Yeah. Since 9/11, do you think that it has changed? Is it better today than it was, or is it worse?
Oh, it's far worse. It's far worse. And I say that both qualitatively and quantitatively. Quantitatively, you can look at the anti-Muslim hate crimes and the racist hate crimes, and they are at levels or higher now than they were right after 9/11. We went from George Bush speaking at a mosque and condemning terrorism and saying Islam is not a religion of evil to Donald Trump saying, I think Islam hates us, whatever the hell that means, and trying to implement a Muslim ban. So it's definitely gotten worse. I remember as a 9-year-old coming home from a family dinner out. Kids these days don't know what the term answering machine is, but we used to actually have these devices that was specifically for your voicemails. Kids don't know what voicemails are either. But I remember my dad hitting play and just this monsoon of Islamophobic rhetoric, camel jockey, sand, N-word, you name it, to tell them to get the F out of our country. And that was me at 8, 9 years old. And I remember the look in my father's eye wasn't just about the pain he felt from hearing that. I think he was okay managing that. I think it was that he saw his son experiencing the same thing. And so you fast forward to 2019, nearly 30 years later, and two things happen. My son tells me he's getting picked on for being Muslim and being called camel jockey and these words. And I'm getting death threats and I'm finding myself in federal court testifying against a man who wanted to kill me for being Muslim as well. So I think it has gotten worse and I'm not disheartened by that. I just see that as we have more work to do and we need to work with more expediency and more conviction.
Yeah. One of the things that I wanted to bring up is that the Asian American group is such a monolith. There's so many different ethnic groups and religions under that umbrella. And I do know that there's a lot of racism within the Asian American community and a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of ignorance. So what do you wish fellow Asian Americans understood about your ethnicity and your religion?
Yeah, I think there's how many 50-some, 60 countries in Asia. Yeah. And within each country, you have how many different ethnic breakdowns. And even within Pakistan, you've got the Punjabis, you've got the Pathans, you've got the Sindhis. There's such a vast array. And then within those, you've got the subsects as well. Part of it, I think you can blame European colonialism that just divided up Asia and the Middle East arbitrarily with lines that they thought make sense, but obviously didn't. But look, I think that there's certainly racism within the Asian community to other Asian demographics. And there's also anti-Black racism as well. there's the legacy of whiteness, right? Whitening creams are a multi-billion-dollar industry in Asia. And as a Pakistani, I'm considered darker skinned than most. And I remember being made fun of by other Pakistanis for being darker skinned. My siblings are all lighter skinned than me. And you could see the aunties and the uncles be like, oh, poor kid, he's the one who got stuck with the dark skin. And I'd be lying if I said it affected me negatively. I always remember thinking, what a moron. What a stupid thing to make fun of me about. There's so much to make fun of me about, but that's what you're going to pick? That's a silly thing. So it never really bothered me, but I can see the impact it's had, right, on others and see the impact that folks have in that space. So I consider myself fortunate that I saw that kind of ridicule as hilarious, not in that the racism was funny, but hilarious in people thinking that that actually mattered. So I guess my advice is it's important that we understand our roots and our history and our interaction with other faiths and cultures to really be able to respect and recognize them. There's a very special verse in the Quran that I always think about where God says that God has created humanity into tribes and sub-tribes so that they will recognize one another. And if I recognize you, it's by definition because I've taken the time to know who you are. So now, we're on the Zoom call, we're looking at each other virtually. Now, if I see you on the street, I'm going to recognize you, right? You're not just going to be some other random person walking down the street. You're not going to be some other random woman or another random Asian. You're going to be my friends that I've talked to now, and I recognize you, and I understand your story, and you understand my story. We appreciate one another. And that word recognize, by definition, requires work, right? The definition of it is that you spent time, you've invested time trying to understand who this person actually is beyond the peripheral level. And that doesn't mean you ignore their distinctions and differences. I can't stand the I don't see color nonsense. Of course, are you colorblind? Are you telling me you have a disability? Because if so, we can talk about that. But if you're saying I don't see color because you're being deliberately blind, that's just ignorance. And recognition requires you appreciate people for who they are and what they bring to the table. And so that's kind of the way I would approach this with my fellow Asians, that take the time to recognize one another, take the time to recognize the many different cultures that exist in Asia, that the cultures that exist within countries as opposed to exclusively between countries. I think there's nuances there as well, like that plug with the name of the podcast.
I've been thinking about having a sound effect that I play every time somebody says the word nuance.
It would work. It would need to be a nuanced sound effect, so it can't be so obvious. So that's kind of the way I approach this, right? Because I can tell you within the South Asian community, there absolutely is anti-Black racism. There absolutely is racism against different cultures. That my brother-in-law's wife is native Thai. And you can see the look on people's faces like, wait, how would you marry a Thai woman? I'm like, why would you be a racist bigot? What is wrong with you? And so there's conversations that need to be had, deliberate conversations. That's why I say we can't take a back seat to somebody else writing our narrative. We need to be affirmative and write it ourselves if we really want to move forward as a society.
Yeah. Have you encountered any misconceptions that seem to be common in the Asian community that you would like to dispel?
Right now, I think one thing that I'm seeing happen is with affirmative action and the weaponizing of Asianness against Blackness.
Yes.
In this case before Harvard right now, that the Supreme Court might overrule affirmative action. There's a lot of ignorance here, right? Because these Asian students are claiming that affirmative action is the reason why I didn't get accepted to school. And no, that's not the reason why. But if you really want to talk about affirmative action, let's talk about legacy affirmative action. Legacy students, for those who aren't familiar with the term, is if your father or grandfather or great-grandfather went to an Ivy League school, you put that down on your application and you get legacy admission, you get priority admission. And you're offered admission whereas somebody else who didn't have that opportunity wouldn't. And the reason why that's such a white supremacist policy is because if you're going to school right now and your grandfather got into Harvard, your grandfather went to Harvard during Jim Crow America, when Black and brown people weren't even allowed to get in. Recent study out of Harvard showed 3/4 of the legacy students are white because this was at a time of Jim Crow America. And so you want to talk about merit? Where was the merit when your grandfather got in and somebody who was more qualified didn't get in because they were a woman or because they were Black or because they were Asian? And now for you to get access because of that white supremacist policy is perpetuating the legacy of white supremacy. And the data is horrifying because I think 46% of admissions are legacy admissions right now. Which is absurd. And 3/4 of those legacy admissions are people who would not have gotten in on their merits alone. They would not have. So you compare that to Black students who are at Harvard, and it's 12 or 13%. Yeah. It's a fraction. And if you were going to tell me that those Black students who are 12 or 13% are the reason why you didn't get in while ignoring the 46% legacy white students, well, you've bought into white supremacy. I'm sorry, but you have. And then adding insult to injury, the single demographic that has benefited most from affirmative action, more than every other demographic combined, are white women. You want to take Black women, Asian women, Black men, Latino men and women, Native American men and women, you combine all of them, and fewer of them have benefited from affirmative action in hiring, in admissions, in job placement, in grant opportunities than white women. They have more than all the rest of them combined. And this is the part that infuriates me about this, because when I see Asians condemning and slamming Black people for affirmative action, what they're effectively doing is buying into a white supremacist narrative that's not grounded in facts, that's not grounded in reality. And worst of all, if they're successful, which it looks like they're going to be because we've got a right-wing nutjobbery Supreme Court, it's not going to actually solve the problem at all. They're still not going to get admission. And now they'll have no one to blame but themselves, because the one slight opportunity offered to help level the playing field that had been unleveled for centuries, now they strip that away as well.
Yeah.
So that's a stereotype that I would hit pretty hard as well. You can tell I'm a little bit fired up about it, because it's just, I'm seeing so many people buy into this narrative, and it's just not based in facts. It is extremely dangerous for our kids.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad that many more Asian Americans are standing up against that and saying, no, actually, that's not how we feel, and we are for affirmative action. But it's just sad to see that some people buy into that.
Absolutely. Yep.
We've been following what's going on in Iran. Do you see parallels with what's happening in Iran in terms of the government taking what they believe to be what Islam preaches to an extreme, and what's going on in the US?
There's a study done a couple of years ago that ranked the 10 most dangerous countries in the world for women. And number 10 was the United States. And it was the most dangerous developed country in the world, but number 10 overall. So yeah, I do see parallels, and I do see data to back that up as well. I've been at the forefront of condemning the misogyny and violence against women in Iran for decades. Their persecution of religious minorities as well is no better. It's in the same vein of extremism. It has no place in a civilized society. The autonomy denied to women in Iran is not only repulsive, but it's extraordinarily dangerous. And frankly, it's stupid from a business standpoint as well. Imagine telling half of your population that you don't have the ability to play an active role in society. Nonsensical, right? However you slice it, it makes no sense. The parallel I'll see here is, look, it comes down to framing, right? When an extremist or a misogynist in Iran commits violence against women, it's called an honor killing. Right? Give it this really dramatic name. It's an honor killing. It's their culture. They want to maintain the honor and purity. And this has been the narrative that's been spewed for quite some time. Here in the United States, they're being repealed finally, but for a while, there was on the books, crime of passion. I caught her committing adultery and I was in a passionate state and killed her, so therefore it's a lesser crime. Nonsense. Right? If an Iranian man had done that, we'd call that, he did an honor killing. But here it's, the poor guy was in a distraught state. And in the United States, 1,600 women a year, 3 to 4 a day, die at the hands of a husband or boyfriend in a gender-based violent attack. The leading cause of injury to women in America is domestic violence. Leading cause of injury. Horrifying, right? But we have the highest maternal mortality rate. We have the highest infant mortality rate. And that is 300% higher for Black children and for Black women. And so I absolutely see the parallels. The framing is different, right? Here it's, that guy was just crazy. But over there, he was an Islamic crazy. It's a different conversation all of a sudden, right? If the only time you care about women's rights is when Black and brown people are abusing women, it's not women's rights you care of. It's upholding white supremacy that you care about. Having worked in the domestic violence and the sexual violence space for well over a decade, I can tell you that patriarchy isn't just a national disease, it's a global cancer. And until and unless we approach this globally, we're not going to make any kind of meaningful improvements. And until and unless we get past the whataboutery, what about over there? So it's worse over there. That doesn't solve anything. We need to recognize this. And then the final thing I'll say about this soapbox is the solution comes from men getting their heads out of their and doing something about it. You can't sit here and say, well, I've never hit a woman before, so therefore this is not my problem. It's necessarily your problem. And it's the difference between being against misogyny and being anti-misogynist. Just because you've never hit a woman before, you don't get a cookie for not being a psychopath, right? You don't get a cookie for being a decent human being. You need to play an active role, talk to your brother, talk to your cousin, talk to your friend, talk to your neighbor who are engaged in these activities. I guarantee you they are. 1 in 3 women has suffered some kind of physical or sexual violence. 1 in 3, by conservative estimates. It's impossible that you don't know somebody who's been involved in that, who's engaged in that kind of atrocity. And if you think that you've done your job by simply saying, well, I never hit somebody, then you're part of the problem. And so men need to play a much more active role in stopping this. And until men play a more active role, I don't really see progress happening. So my push is to get my fellow men off their butts and do something productive with their lives.
Yeah, and it's a lot more subtle than that too. When a lot of people think domestic violence, they just think the end result of somebody being assaulted. But there's so much more, like making jokes about it or people making comments that you could tell are like sexist comment, but you don't say anything. These little things add up and enable people to then commit those acts.
And to build on that, Sherry, people see domestic violence as limited to physical violence, right? They'll ignore, to the detriment of society, mental health torture, right? Constant verbal abuse is a form of domestic violence. They'll ignore financial restraints, right? You controlling the purse strings and denying a woman financial independence and liberty is a form of violence. They'll ignore emotional trauma, right? Threatening her that we're going to deport you. And this is, I work with a lot of immigrants, a lot of abusive men, their wife will be an immigrant and she hasn't gotten her citizenship yet. They'll say, if you act out, then I'm going to get you deported and keep the kids here, right? That's an emotional. So they'll never lay a hand on her, but they'll make that threat. And that emotional violence and trauma will be enough for her to not have independence. And so it goes far beyond something as direct as laying your hand on somebody. And in some respects, that trauma can be just as bad or even worse. That's why things like the child separation policy is a form of violence that the UN has called this a form of genocide. That's how severe it actually is. Expand your thought process to say, just because I've never hit somebody, I've never committed domestic violence. If you've denied a woman financial autonomy and independence, if you denied her physical movement independence, if you denied her emotional comfort, caused her mental trauma, these are all forms of domestic violence. And if you've committed them, you need to check yourself. And if you've seen that happen in your family or in your community, you need to check them and make sure it stops. Because until we can comprehensively stop this cancer, we're not going to make the kind of progress we need to make.
Yeah. And actually, that was one of the questions we wanted to talk to you about. As you said, a lot of people think domestic violence is just physical violence, but there's so many other ways that people can be abused. What are some things that you found people didn't realize were abusive? Because I have a feeling that a lot of people stay in those abusive relationships just because they don't realize that's actually abuse. That's not normal. Can you give us some examples? If you're in that situation, that's not normal. You should consider trying to get out.
Beyond that, this comment you made about try to get out is a really important comment because a significant number of women are killed while trying to leave abusive relationship. And so when someone says, if it was that bad, why didn't she just leave?
Yeah.
Because she probably knew that she suffered serious consequences. And so getting out isn't just as easy as picking up the keys, getting in a car and leaving.
Yeah.
Getting out isn't just as simple as saying, I want a divorce or I want to end this relationship. It goes far beyond that. Because if he's abusive, that's when he's most likely to act out as well. And so it takes a lot of planning and time and support. So if you're someone who knows somebody in an abusive relationship, when you encourage them to leave for their own safety and well-being, don't just verbally say, hey, get out of this relationship. Say, you need to leave and I'm here to help you. I can provide transportation. I can provide shelter. I can provide money. I can provide confidentiality. I can get you to a lawyer. I can get you to a hospital. Go beyond just the verbal, you need to get out of here. Because that to somebody who is stuck in 10 feet of mud, just telling them unstuck yourself from mud is not a solution. And so some examples where I've had clients and I've said, look, this is going to be hard for me to say to you and it's going to be hard for you to hear, but you're suffering under domestic abuse. And you have to frame those conversations very carefully because it can be an embarrassing thing, right? Society has made it an embarrassing thing and nobody wants to admit they're the victim. But something like taking away her phone so she can't communicate with family and friends, right? There's no physical violence involved there necessarily. There's no threats even necessarily, but taking away her phone and preventing her from being able to call her family, her friends, her social network, that's a form of abuse, right? Constant tracking of where a person is to the point where you're not allowed to be anywhere without express knowledge and consent of the other person, right? I get it. The couples and spouses, and they like to know where the other person is. I get all that. But there's a difference between saying, hey, I'm going to go to the store. I'll be back in an hour versus I was tracking you and you went to the store and then you went to this other place. Where was that? What's happening? Who was all there? One of the questions to ask yourself is, do I have the confidence to go somewhere without having to get this person's permission to go? And if they were to find out, would I be in trouble? And if you can't answer confidently in the affirmative that you'd be okay, you need to think about it. And there's hotlines and helplines you can call to have conversations with experts in the space. I want to be very careful not to convey what I'm saying now as the be all end all, because every situation is nuanced. Every situation is different. But these are some questions that you should be asking yourself, and you should feel comfortable reaching out to these anonymous hotlines and tip lines, and every state has them, and just say, hey, look, I need clarity on what's happening here and what I can or what I should do.
Yeah, we'll put links in the show notes to the hotlines. And
Great.
Yeah. When it comes to conversations about racism, how do you approach those intersectional conversations, especially when minorities are pitted against each other? We've talked a little bit about affirmative action, but in general, how can we be better at talking about race, ethnicity, and religion? A lot of times it's such a loaded conversation where sometimes people are afraid to even engage in it because they're afraid of saying something wrong. Or sometimes they go about it and then things explode. So what advice do you have on that?
I think anytime you get into that kind of a conversation, there's a couple of rules I bring to the table. One is understand what the end goal is. Make sure it's a noble end goal. If my end goal is just to piss you off and to win an argument, that's great if you're deciding who's better, LeBron or Michael Jordan, and the answer is clearly Michael Jordan. If that's the debate, that's fine. If you just want to piss off your friends and tick them off, yeah, that's the kind of debate to have that. What's better, Five Guys or In-N-Out, right? That's a debate to have there. I think they're both terrible, but whatever. When you're talking about something as serious as racial justice, then that can't be the approach, right? The approach has to be, how can I find a way to connect with this person? And even if there's no way to connect with this particular person, how can I present myself? And I've coined this term called collateral education. How do I create a situation where even if the person I'm talking to refuses to listen, refuses to agree with basic facts and premises and logic, then at the very minimum, those watching and observing can say, he's making a pretty good point. I think I'm going to go ahead and learn more about that point. And the premise to all of that is to come into it with positive intent, assuming positive intent. And this can be really difficult, right? Because we're in this hyper debate environment of I'm gonna dunk on you publicly. And I have my TikTok videos where I've had to debunk people. I don't actually like doing them, right? I'll do them when someone is just so off their rocker that I'm like, this is absurd. But I don't get any actual joy out of dunking on people because I'm like, I wish we could have had just a civilized conversation without name calling. But now that it's resorted to that, let me just present the facts for the people to see, not because I think this person is going to be convinced, but because I think people deserve to hear what the actual solution to this question really is. And so when I approach a conversation with someone and we're trying to have this discussion, my approach isn't to say, here are the 17 reasons why you're wrong. Is to ask questions. Like when I talk about a conversation, I mean like a real life conversation. I don't mean like the social media back and forth. I don't think that solves much. But my question would be, okay, look, let's talk about what we both agree on. We both agree we want X. The question is, how do we get there? Help me understand why you think your approach makes more sense. And what that does is, just from a psychological perspective, if my first approach is to say, I want to understand you better, then they're letting their guard down. They're seeing the sincerity in me and trying to understand what exactly they're talking about. And then rather than just trying to dunk on them and walk off stage with a mic drop, we're trying to see where the conversation is going. And those observing and watching can see, okay, there's actually one person at the minimum who's well-intentioned and the other person is just being a petulant child. People are good about you being able to differentiate between the two. And look, at the end of the day, and the reason why I say assume positive intent, at the end of the day, Malcolm X talked about this, don't be in such a hurry to judge somebody because they don't think as you think or act as you do. There was a time when you didn't know what you know now.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's about giving people the benefit of the doubt. I'm an immigrant. I'm bilingual. I can't tell you the last time I gave a public lecture and somebody didn't come up to me and say, oh my God, you're so articulate. And like, they don't understand why that's a problematic statement to make. But if I said to them, God, what a racist comment. What is wrong with you? It would have undermined the entire lecture. And it's not helpful to the overall cause. And so assume positive intent. In that situation, this person, the fact that they are coming to this event, the fact that they're having the conversation means that they have some semblance, some desire to want to improve. And so if somebody uses the wrong pronouns, if somebody says a phrase that's a microaggression, it's not the end of the world. There's a difference between a microaggression and calling you a sand N-word to your face. Right. And we need to have that nuance to be able to differentiate that. And in my experience, I think my greatest gift I've been given is having these conversations and then having somebody respond to me completely anonymously or completely unknown to me and say, hey, I actually used to think that Muslims were this evil thing, but seeing how you responded made me realize I was wrong. And now I have the tools to disarm other people in my own family who have that wrong impression. For me, that is the mic drop, right? It's not the public got 20,000 retweets and dunking on somebody. It's that really honest, sincere person who maybe didn't have access to that experience earlier on, looking at something that we did and coming in and saying, wow, that's amazing. I never looked at it that way. I feel embarrassed about the past, but I feel good about going forward. That for me is the ultimate victory. That's the stuff that I love to push out.
Yeah, going through your archives, I saw the story about Oz Dillon and how you turned him around. He was one of your critics and he was saying really mean things about Muslims, and you were able to reach out to him and actually turn him around. So temporarily.
Yeah. The full story is about 3 months later, he went full circle and became the exact same Islamophobic bigot that he was, unfortunately. The backstory is I was running for Congress some years ago. This guy sent me a really nasty Islamophobic, racist comment. I was about to block him and move on, but I clicked on his profile and realized he was actually a constituent and lived 10 minutes from me, which is a little bit unnerving, but I thought, okay, let me see what I can do here. I saw that he had a GoFundMe for his wife's, I think his wife had cancer or some kind of horrible disease, and they were like 20-some thousand in debt. So I gave $50 to his GoFundMe. And I think I tweeted something to the effect of, this person hates me for being Muslim. My faith calls on me to uphold justice above all else. And I believe healthcare is a human right. So I've given $50 to his account. If you can donate, please do it. Like within a day, we raised like 26 grand or 28 grand and he paid off his debt. He called me apologetic and wanted to put my campaign sign in his yard. And I said, look, you don't owe me anything. It's not your fault you got sick. And I think it's a shame that in this country, people are going into medical bankruptcy and dying because they can't pay for basic healthcare. And I'm happy to provide support wherever I could. Unfortunately, I think when you're in that kind of a social circle, he was influenced pretty heavily by his social network. And he went back to sending me threats. And eventually I had to cut him off. And so somebody said to me, don't you regret raising money for him and helping him when he was so ungrateful, hateful towards you even afterwards? And I said, if I had known that helping him would result in no change in him and only get him out of debt, then I would have done it again 1,000 times over. Because I'm not looking to help him because I want some public accolade or I want him to appreciate me. That's irrelevant to me. This is what Islam calls me to do, that you support people on the tenets of justice and compassion and kindness because it's the right thing to do. Not because you're looking for some heavenly reward, not because you're looking to go into paradise, but because as a moral precept, it's the right thing to do, period. End of conversation. Again, for me, that whole experience, what was extraordinarily rewarding about that experience was I probably got 10,000 messages from people between tweets and DMs and emails and shares, easily 10,000 or more messages from people. And I cannot tell you how many of them were exactly that comment that, wow, I never realized that Islam requires you to help people regardless of how they treat you, that it calls you to uphold justice no matter what the situation is, that at the very minimum, that even if people treat you with injustice, you respond to them with justice. For me, that was a win, right? Because that's collateral education. That is an inoculation against bigotry. It's a vaccination against hate. And all those thousands of people, next time their racist Uncle Bobby at the kitchen table says something Islamophobic, they can say, here's why you're wrong. Mark Twain says there's nothing quite as annoying as a good example, right? So for me, that is where those conversations are most meaningful. Not when you're trying to convince one person. Sure, you want to win the hearts and minds of everybody out there. But when you're leading by a proven model that you know will appeal to human nature and human intellect, and hopefully, if you're lucky and you have those opportunities, even when it's difficult, you're successful in helping win hearts and minds, even if it's not the person that you're directly talking to.
How do you keep your calm? Intellectually, we know that you're right and that we should keep our calm and keep the end goal in mind. But sometimes when you're in that situation and somebody's just egging you on, you just lose it. So how do you personally keep that zen where you're able to still engage in a positive way and not lose your cool? Because sometimes that can be really hard.
Absolutely. Yeah. Extremely well said. And it's definitely a learned skill over time. I apply two aspects to this thing. One is that from an Islamic standpoint, one of the unique elements of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is that he's called the exemplar, that he exemplified how we should behave. He was an orphan by the age of 6. By the age of 8, he lost his grandfather. So in the first 8 years of his life, he lost 3 of the closest people to him. And then he was unlettered, meaning he could neither read nor write. And to make a very epic story simplified, He suffered horrific persecution. He was exiled. He had to leave. The persecution was so bad that these extremists killed his pregnant daughter, so killed his unborn grandchild as well. After 20 years of brutal persecution, after 10 years of exile, when he returned to Mecca with an army of 10,000 soldiers, Adila Martin and Stanley Lane Poole and many other scholars write that the entire city was in the palm of his hand. A city that had persecuted him for no other reason than his claim that God is one and humanity is all equal, that men and women are equal. And at that point in time, despite the persecution, despite the violence, despite his own flesh and blood being murdered and killed, to these same people, instead of exacting any kind of punishment on them, he gives a flag to a man named Bilal, who's an African who had been enslaved and brutally tortured. And he says to these former enslavers that anybody who wants amnesty, you will find it under the flag of Bilal. I can't think of a more powerful example to break down white supremacy, classism, racism. And then he asks the criminals, what should be your punishment? And they respond that we expect nothing but forgiveness from you. And so his response is, as Joseph said to his erring brothers, the famous story of Joseph in the Bible, it's also in the Quran, that his brothers tried to kill him and Joseph forgave them. He says, as Joseph said to his erring brothers, no punishment shall be on you this day. And history records that there was no punishment given out. And so that's the first thing I think about, right? That if that's the level that I'm called to, then, you know, what's a couple of name calling? It's nothing by comparison. And then the second aspect of it is, it's not just a matter of forgiveness. It's not just a matter of saying it's all good. It's a matter of meaningful reform and meaningful rehabilitation of a society. And you do that not by thumping of scripture and saying, this says thou shalt not XYZ. I think that's a nonsensical way to practice religion. You do that by fulfilling the fundamental human rights that every person is entitled to. Food, water, shelter, healthcare, education, clothing, right? These fundamental core elements. And so we live in a society right now where we are the wealthiest country in the world, but 1 in 6 families are food insecure. 80% of people live paycheck to paycheck. 600,000 people annually fall into medical bankruptcy. 70,000 people a year die waiting for healthcare. We have 17 million vacant homes, yet nearly 1 million Americans are homeless. 17 million vacant homes, nearly 1 million Americans are homeless. And so when you think about just the disconnection from these basic human rights and where we are, my whole trajectory is, if I waste my time getting upset because this person called me a bad word, that's time that could be spent trying to solve hunger, trying to solve racial violence, gender-based violence. And I don't have the patience to waste worrying about some internet when I know I would be much better spending that time ensuring that we're passing legislation to stop hunger, to stop poverty, to stop people dying of disease. So it's those two things combined that I have to refocus on a regular basis for sure. It's not like an automatic thing. I'm not some special person, but it allows me to really refocus and recalibrate in my mind, why am I doing what I'm actually doing, and why is it the right way to go about things, and why, in my view, is the best way to go about things. And if somebody can provide a better way, I'm all ears. I'm all for it. But that really helps me maintain my sense of comfort and confidence and really my happiness in knowing that the work I'm doing is for a cause. It's moving the ball forward, and I'm not just spinning my wheels.
Yeah. One other really good example in your book that I enjoyed was when you were at the book fair in Miami and you talked to Archie. For the listeners who haven't read the book yet, Archie is this super antagonistic guy who's just out there to spew anti-Muslim rhetoric to you. In both cases with Archie and Mr. Dillon, you engaged with them, right? And you tried to engage them.
Yeah.
And in one case, you were able to have a meaningful conversation, and in the other, you weren't. At what point should we give up?
Yeah, never. I'll give you a third example. Because again, remember, you're not just talking to the person you're talking to. We live in a world where every interaction can be a lesson for humanity. I'll give you another really good example. Another time I was running for office years ago, it was actually the very first time I ever ran. I found out that there was going to be an anti-Islam rally nearby my house. And this was not long after Trump had announced the Muslim ban. So there was a huge fervor, right? And the Islamophobes were like, yes, we got our guy in the White House. We're going to expel all these camel jockeys and get rid of these Muslims. And so I'm like, hey, I'm going to go to this rally. And my team was like, are you out of your mind? You're going to go to like, what are you thinking? I'm like, I think I'm going to go to this rally. I think I need to be there. And things happen in interesting ways. You can call it God works in mysterious ways. You can call it bad traffic. But I get to this rally. It's a pretty good sized group. There's probably a couple of hundred people, except one person was missing. The anti-Islam speaker that they had brought in wasn't there. they had gotten stuck in traffic. And it was ironic because that was the number one issue for the district at the time as well, traffic. And so I knew that because I was from the district. And so I left plenty of time ahead to get there in time. And so we find out that they're not going to be there for another hour. And so I'm like, all right, what the hell? I'm not going to waste my time. I got up on stage and I started talking. I started talking about what Islam actually teaches. I had their flyer of all the evils of creeping Sharia coming in and enslaving the Christian and all this nonsense. And so I came up and I started answering question after question, having a very robust dialogue with the folks there. And lo and behold, by the time the speaker arrived, I had already armed them with all the knowledge necessary to debunk her simplistic arguments. And when she started speaking, she kept on being interrupted by the speakers debunking her nonsense in real time. And then it gets better. And so then I took that, I wrote a post for social media, I tweeted a thread about it. We ended up raising, I think, close to $10,000 for the campaign from this really negative event. And to answer your question, we never give up. We find different ways. And I want to be clear in that there's no one right way to do this stuff, right? People function in different ways. I have one of my cousins, he's a hardcore introvert. Right? You can't get him out of his shell if you put a gun to his head, but he loves to draw and he will draw the most amazing art to talk about what he's feeling when it relates to things like Islamophobia and racism. And it gets thousands of likes and shares and whatnot as well, right? And so everybody has a different way. You just got to figure out what yours actually is. And if your focus, if your trajectory is that your life's purpose is to uphold justice and serve humanity to the best of your ability, then you're not really worried about things out of your control. You're only worried about, am I internally, and we all have an internal clock, an internal conscience that tells us if we really are doing our best. And as long as we can honestly answer that question ourselves, and that involves taking the mental health breaks and the physical breaks when you need to, then I think giving up doesn't really come into question. You work until you can, and then when you can't, you do something else.
Yeah. Do you ever block people though?
Oh, all the time. Yes, all the time. Yeah. Look,
so how do you choose who to block?
I don't think I have a science behind it. I think there's enough bots and not real people out there that if it's like a first name, bunch of numbers, I'm like, all right, I'm not going to waste my time with this. I've blocked people who are prominent, but they work for like a Breitbart, Daily Wire, Daily Caller, white supremacist outlet. And I say this in full disclosure. Years ago, I actually wrote an article unpaid for the Daily Caller. I think Mike Huckabee said some Islamophobic stuff and I pitched them an op-ed to debunk it and they published it. So I'm like, great. But I'm not going to necessarily spend my time on people who are actually working actively for white supremacist outlets. I've built a pretty decent sized online social media platform, and I'm not going to elevate a white supremacist on that platform. There are certain guidelines that I'm very careful about. But again, I think there is no harm, no shame in blocking somebody, just saying, look, I don't have the time for this today. Yeah. Protect your mental health, my friends. Just protect it and be extremely jealously guarded of it. And so don't let anything I'm saying convince you that you have to engage with every single person out there. You don't. You can block as much as you want. But when you do engage, then don't do so with the intent that victory means I have to convince this person. No, victory should be, did you convey your message in the way you wanted to convey it? Did you write your narrative in the way you wanted to convey it? And if you did, you should be content with that and be ready to move on.
Yeah. That's great advice. Now, on social media, a lot of people like you who are speaking up about injustice are getting banned or mass reported or otherwise silenced. What has that been like for you, and what advice do you have for people navigating activism online?
I think TikTok is probably one of the bigger offenders there. Yeah. I'm having people on Facebook tell me that they follow me and haven't seen my content for months, and then they went to the page manually and saw it posting regularly. Yeah, that's frustrating. I think the lesson learned from there is don't let the extent of your activism be social media. That's part of it for sure. There's small things you can do. I've got my own email list. You can set up a free widget online where people can sign up and be part of your email list, right? It allows people to opt in manually, and then it's great because then you can email them regularly and you control your email, right? There's consistencies in different platforms, right? So don't just put all your eggs in one basket. Like I'm on Twitter and TikTok and Facebook and YouTube and Instagram, and I'm trying to get on Twitch and I'm trying to get on Mastodon and all these other platforms. So use different modes of communication as well, because people respond in different ways. People respond to different styles as well. And the thing is, if the extent of your activism is you tweeted and then you went to a rally and then you went home, then you may as well have just sat home, right? Let that be a step forward towards voting. towards getting people registered to vote, to helping a candidate you believe in win an election. And if you can't find a candidate you believe in, then run for office yourself. But don't let the frustration of social media algorithms be the blockade, right? Our forefathers, and when I talk about the civil rights era, they fought police batons. And depending on your background, your ancestry, if you were Jewish, you fought the Holocaust. If you were African American, you fought the slave trade. If you were South Asian, you fought the famines imposed by Europe. If you're the Uyghur Muslims, right, you're fighting genocide. The Rohingya, you're fighting genocide. And I'm not saying this to compare any of these scars, but to acknowledge the validity of all these scars. And James Baldwin talks about how, he's talking about Black people in particular, but he talks about when you think about what Black people have been asked to accomplish, they've been asked to accomplish the impossible. But guess what? They've done it anyway. And so don't let a social media algorithm be the pebble that trips you up. Recognize it for what it is, diversify your approach, diversify your actions, and go beyond social media into the realm of in-person advocacy. And I promise you, a social media platform or not, you can have a major impact.
Now, there are so many issues and they're all kind of related. Climate change, poverty, women's rights. Sometimes it can be a little overwhelming because there's so many things you want to support and you can't support everything and feel like you're making a dent in anything. So how do you choose, and should we be picking a lane and focusing on something? How do you prioritize where you spend your activism energy on?
Look, this is what I tell young people. You're not going to boil the ocean, right? And if somebody is trying to fight cancer, doesn't mean that they don't care about AIDS. If somebody is trying to combat homophobia, doesn't mean that they don't care about anti-Semitism. If somebody's trying to combat misogyny, doesn't mean that they don't care about Islamophobia. Sure, there's intersectionality, but you're not going to boil the ocean. What you're going to do is drown in a sea of despair because there's so much injustice out there and you can't possibly address all of it. Likewise, by trying to address all of it, I was going to say risk, but you actually guarantee you're going to fail at all of it. And I don't just mean fail in that you don't make a difference. I fail in that you make enemies out of the people doing the work as well, because it's going to seem like you're just doing it for clout. You're just peripherally involved. I'll give you my own example. I care about a lot of issues, but you're going to see 99% of my content talk about racial justice, economic justice, gender justice, right? I'm not the go-to person for climate issues. It's important. I talk about it, right? But I don't have a degree in climate science. I'm not the expert there. I refer to the experts and elevate their content. I'm not the go-to person on LGBTQ issues. I care about the Equality Act and condemning homophobia and providing support and resources for LGBTQ Americans, but I'm not the expert on this. So I don't pretend to be. I'm not the expert on animal welfare. I love animals, right? Who doesn't? But I'm not the expert on stopping animal abuse. So I refer to the experts. I give those examples to illustrate how you can care about an issue, but you can also know your lane. And in those spaces, my lane is to push and promote the people who are doing the work as opposed to stepping in their shoes. The other thing you do when you really isolate yourself into a particular area of expertise is you can then become the magnet to rally and organize people, right? I see change coming as a 4-step process. And this is not my idea. This is a pretty well-established concept. First, you have to activate people. Then you have to mobilize them. Then you organize them. And then when you combine all that together, you transform the situation at hand. And so think about what gets you out of bed, what activates you, what really gets you fired up. And there's got to be a couple of things that are more than others. And if you think they're all the same, then just push yourself harder and harder. That if you really had to pick and choose, what would you pick? And then once you get activated on that, then mobilize in that space. Meaning do the work yourself, volunteer, get involved, understand it from the root level. Once you're mobilized yourself, then start to organize other folks to work with you as well. And when you're effective in organizing, then you're going to be able to transform and bring about some meaningful change. And the last thing I'll say about this is that keep in mind that the structures of injustices that we're fighting were not created overnight. These are systemic. They're legacy. They're generational. They've been around for decades, centuries. You want to talk about misogyny, millennia. And they're not going to be resolved because you had a tweet go viral. They're not going to be resolved because you voted in one election. It will take time. When a journalist asks James Baldwin about progress and change, he has this beautiful quote where he says, "What is it that you want me to resign myself to? You've always told me it takes time. It's taken my mother's time and my father's time. It's taken my brother's time and my sister's time, my aunt and my uncle's time, my nephew and my niece's time. How much time do you want for your progress?" And he's calling out this journalist to say, "You're setting my human rights on your timetable. How convenient for you to tell me, don't worry about the fact that you don't have equal rights as a Black person. Just give it time." And yes, work with urgency, but don't get disheartened if you're not successful the first time or the second time. It will only be through that consistency that we'll be able to overcome those injustices. Think about what you're focused on. Go 6 inches wide and 10 miles deep on that particular issue. Become the expert, organize folks. And if you're consistent with it, that transformation absolutely will come.
Yeah, that's great advice. Now, in your book, talked to me, you had an anecdote where your director, Bert, pulled you aside one day and basically told you were working too much and you should go home and spend time with your son. So I wanted to ask you, how do you set healthy boundaries in your activism journey? What are you doing to keep a healthy boundary between your work and family?
That story, it was probably the beginning of the end for me to work in a corporate environment. The more I realized this is sucking the life out of me and I'm spending more time at work than with family, why am I even working? And I had this internal test that, okay, if I stay with this company and make this and make that, I'll have this many millions of dollars by this age. And I thought, okay, but my kids will be grown by then. I started to give myself a number. I'm like, okay, let's say I have $10 million by the time I'm 50. Let's say I have 20 million. Let's say I have $100 million. Would I give all that up? Is there a certain amount of money that would justify not seeing my kids grow up because I'm working all the time? Let's say I had $1 billion by the time I'm 50. Would I give up that $1 billion to be able to go back in time to the time I'm 26, 27 and just spend the time with my kids? And I'm like, yeah, of course I would. And so in my mind, I'm like, then why the hell am I chasing that money right now when I would rather just spend the time with my kids as it is? And so that was for me a wake-up call. Bert was a phenomenal leader. He very tragically has passed away since then. But that lesson was something that stayed with me. But setting healthy boundaries, I think it comes from understanding your own limitations and understanding what your long-term goals are. I read a great quote that when people set boundaries with you, it's not because they want to push you away, it's because they want you around and they want to do it on healthy terms. And take the time to understand what your boundaries are and why they are, and then be able to hold them up consistently. And the most awkward part is going to be the first time you set that boundary. But once that boundary is set and hopefully people are respectful of it, then that interaction model becomes much more effective and enjoyable. And you enjoy engaging with that person. You enjoy engaging with that work in a way that you wouldn't otherwise. Because just like you eat your favorite candy too much, that one bite where you're like, all right, this tastes nasty now. You almost wish you could have stopped. Or just like your favorite song, once you listen to it too much, you're like, all right, I can't stand this song anymore. It's setting that healthy boundary. And it begins, I think, internally with knowing what your individual goals are. And once you've analyzed and spent time doing that, then when that song comes on, you can enjoy that song because it's been 3 weeks since you last heard it and you miss it. Like when I was in high school, the song Iris by Goo Goo Dolls was every other song. And at the time I loved it. And then by the time I got to like my senior year, I'm like, I can't stand this song anymore. And I would change the channel every single time. And then now that my kid is nearly in high school, it comes on iTunes. I'm like, okay, I like this song again. But it took 20 years of not listening to the song for me to like it again. I don't want that to happen with your activism.
Yeah.
Awesome.
All right.
Well, thank you so much for all the knowledge and wisdom that you imparted.
No, I don't know about that. I think you're giving me too much credit, but I'll take it. Thank you.
We like to end our interview with our rapid fire questions. Is there one word or one phrase answers you don't have to explain, but you can if you want to?
Okay.
I know you have a hard stop, so we'll try to make it quick.
Great.
All right. All right. Go.
So the first one is, what's an Asian food that you should like but don't?
An Asian food that I should like but don't. It's a South Asian dish called pie. It's not like the pie in America. It's a very greasy type of beef that everybody in my family loves it. I can't stand it. And they all make fun of me for it. But that's okay. I'm sticking to my guns.
All right. What's an Asian food that you'll never get tired of?
Oh man, it's gonna be so anticlimactic. Dal. It's like a lentil soup. When my wife and I got married, she's a chef in the family. She's much better cook than I can ever be. I'm like, if we just have dal every day for the rest of the time we're married till we die, I'll be happy. She goes, yeah, okay. After a decade, she's like, I thought you were lying. I can't believe that you haven't gotten sick of this yet. I'm sick of it. I'm like, yeah. It's just, it's tasty, it's nutritious, and it's efficient to eat.
I love dal as well.
It's so good. So good.
Yeah. What is your mother tongue and what other languages do you speak?
It's funny. I think English has probably become my mother tongue now. The first language I learned to speak was Urdu, and I still speak Urdu pretty fluently. I think I definitely have an American accent to it. I'm trying to learn Spanish, but I'm failing horribly because I'm not being as consistent as I should. I can read Arabic and understand a little bit of Arabic as well. Just most Muslim kids learn to read Arabic growing up. But I tell you what, I am extraordinarily envious of polyglots. Wish I could speak 10 languages. I have friends who can, and it's just amazing watching them.
Yeah, I agree with you on that sentiment. If I could choose a superpower, I would choose the ability to just pick up any language.
Yes.
Yeah. What is your proudest achievement so far?
Yeah, for me, that's an awkward question because I don't think I've really done much yet. I've got a lot of work to do yet. If having 3 happy and healthy kids, although that's mostly my wife anyway. So I will get back to you on that one. I really can't think of anything right now.
All right. What is the last or worst dad joke you have made?
First of all, there's no such thing as a bad dad joke. All right. The last one I made was so good that my wife's eyes nearly rolled out of her head and my 13-year-old ran out of the room. God, what was it? Oh my God, it'll come to me. The thing about dad jokes that people don't understand is that once you become a dad, this part of your DNA activates to make it a compulsion to look for dad jokes in every possible scenario. You can't control it. And I feel like the anti-dad joke persecution that we have in society is really unacceptable. No, the one that I actually, this is a little bit mean actually to my kids. I'm like, hey, I think we're going to get a dog. And my kids are like, are you serious? We're going to get a dog finally? I'm like, yeah, I'm looking for this really rare breed that gets sad when you feed it cantaloupe. And he said, what's it called? I'm like, it's a melancholy. See, that's pretty good, right? That's one of my favorite
I haven't
ones.
heard that one.
Yeah, that's an original. That one's an original. So yeah, my wife, because she wants a dog, and my kids do too. And I'm like, no, because I'll be stuck taking care of it, and we got a big backyard, and they're like, we need it, and they made all the arguments. And so when I said that, they got excited, and then when I gave that punchline, my son literally ran out of the room, and I laughed like I've never laughed before.
It sounds like that's your proudest achievement so far.
There we go. Answered 2 questions with 1 dad joke. That's how powerful dad jokes are.
All right. Before we let you go, do you want to let people know where they can find you?
Yeah, no, I'm very easy to find online. My website is qasimrashid.com. It's got a little form to email me directly there as well. I'm on social media at Qasim Rashid, QasimRashid, across all social media platforms. If you have any difficulty finding me, just Google my name and my website comes up and my social media comes up. But yeah, definitely reach out. I would love to hear from you.
Thank you so much for spending the time with us this morning. Great
Definitely.
chatting with you.
No, my privilege. Thanks for doing the show and looking forward to chatting again soon.
Here are our takeaways for today's episode. Number 1, if you don't tell your story, someone else will write a narrative for you and you might not like it. Number 2, many African slaves were Muslim and were educated. They organized revolts and protests against slavery, and they also built much of this country. Number 3, white supremacy thrives on pitting minorities against each other. Number 4, domestic violence takes many forms, including physical abuse, verbal abuse, threats of deportation, financial restrictions, movement restrictions, and other forms of intimidation. Number 5, without financial, legal, logistical, and emotional support, it can be nearly impossible for someone to escape from an abusive relationship. So offer support if you're trying to help them leave. Number 6, domestic violence is everyone's problem, and Qasim calls on especially his fellow men to do their part and intervene when they see men being abusive to women or being sexist. Number 7, when discussing serious topics such as race, keep in mind the end goal. If the goal is to change hearts and minds, then you have to assume positive intent and really try to understand where the other person is coming from. Number 8, often you won't change someone's mind, but if you've conveyed your message in the way that you want it to, it might inspire others watching to learn more about your perspective. That's collateral education, and that's a win. Number 9, activism is different for everyone. The key is doing something that is sustainable for you over time. Number 10, it is important to be on many different platforms, both to connect with different people and also to protect yourself from being subject to the whims of any particular platform. Number 11, pick your lane and elevate the expert voices in the other areas you care about without stepping on their toes. Number 12, when someone sets a boundary with you, that means that they want you in their life and that they want that relationship to be a healthy one, so that's a good thing. Number 13, know what truly is important to you and organize your life around it. That's it for today. I hope you're all enjoying a happy, safe holiday season. For those of you who are gathering with family, this might be the time to open the conversation again about masking and testing before getting together, masking in public places, etc., etc. I hope you're all staying safe, and I hope you'll tune in next week for a special holiday episode.